Okay, so
Sorry.
where were we?
We were talking about essay writing. Hello, we're back. This is
Take two.
Take two. We were talking about essay writing and how it was important.
Yeah. So I wanted to know like your take on like perspective of using essay writing in a classroom.
Right. And
so why it's a valuable piece of assessment, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, so talking about the work with the anti-rubric is that it's a messy process, and I think that allowing essay writing to be a messy process is so important because we put so much pressure on kids to produce this like perfect, like I know that this is true, and if you read so much academic research and academic writing, it's usually a bunch of information, and then they say we don't actually know for sure what the conclusion is, but here's an exploration of what we think may be the conclusion, and training, I think, students to write with that kind of mindset rather than, I have to prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt that, Hamlet is a tragic character and here's why, and this is thing and this is done, and I think can be detrimental to kind of exploring your own thoughts. So I also talked about how, presenting your paper, like I did in one class, is like you write a paper, you present it to your classmates in the form of like a formal presentation, and then you have a discussion on it. Then it's more meaningful than just like, I just handed in that paper to that prof.
So what about like if a student, for certain students who aren't as like adept at being able to translate their thoughts into writing, and then furthermore like retranslate that from the paper into like a form of presentation
Well, I mean, if you look at the curriculum for English Language Arts B30, those are actually both requirements. So doing a formal presentation as well as essay writing is a formal what am I trying to say? Outcome.
Right.
So I would say something like the Rick Mercer rant video that we did would be kind of an introduction to that. So you're writing a script trying to prove a point, but then it's only 2 minutes long.
And that's focusing more specifically on one subject area too.
Yeah.
So like if we were to take a essay and try to incorporate that into like another subject area, for like math, for example.
Right.
How would that look for you?
I think that would have to be more project based. In that case, the essay would be more of a support paper. So what are you trying to prove? Are we engineering something? Is that more physics, or are we exploring different ways of like organizing data, for example, is a math outcome? So then your paper would be more explaining, well, I thought that this was a good way to organize my data, but then I found that if I, did this calculation, I'm not a math person, but I found that if I actually, shifted and looked at it this way, and so your paper would be more thinking and typing out your thought process, and less of I proved math.
Right.
And then it changes the perspective for the student, and that's why I think projects are so great, because then you have a product at the end that you're like, I did that, instead of just handing in a test or an essay.
So like it, in a sense, like both have their values, just in different aspects, and depending on what.
I think it depends. I think it depends where your students are at too. Because I think in our class there was a lot of pushback
for the project base.
For the project base, I think so. Which
I think a lot of that was in part just because of like the types of projects they were. A lot of the students in our class, as an example, aren't as familiar with using that kind of medium, or any kind of medium outside of like test writing and
essay writing.
Yeah,
which I think is like a huge disservice, because we didn't go to school with cross-curricular competencies in mind. We were kind of the last generation with the old school, and like we weren't, because they just thought we were going to have the same jobs. And I can tell you, as like a contractor artist, like I'm problem solving all the time, and we were trained to like work in a factory. which
a
doesn't
lot
exist.
of it was basically just about regurgitating information.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
So when it comes to assessment, I'm really struggling with, this new epistemological setting of interdisciplinary 20th century competencies, and how are we going to grade that without a rubric, and then how are we going to do that and keep ourselves sane at the same time? That's something I've really been pondering.
So, like with the success criteria, you can kind of get like a lot of the positives of a rubric in that element, but with like more leeway for what you're writing and
Right.
how you're assigning the grade. So it might help in a sense, so that where you can like detail out exactly what you want with your students for the assignment, and so include things that are related directly to particular cross-curricular competencies like your critical thinking.
How do you grade critical thinking, though?
That's a good question. I think that a lot of that would have to go into being able to observe the students' thought processes rather than necessarily just having them write down a list of questions, because they could easily just memorize some
Their
questions
answers
that they saw someplace else. So seeing that process helps you determine like how they came up with these questions and where they might be coming from in that sense.
What I would like is the application and the transferable knowledge, because I had to, in my pre-internship, I actually had to train an accompanist. So like a grade 10 boy who, could play piano but didn't necessarily know how to accommodate a choir. And specifically my co-op said, okay, well, if I work on a piece with them and I say, okay, here's the alto, tenor, and soprano note, if I go to a different piece, they haven't transferred, here's the alto, tenor, soprano note. And so that transfer of knowledge isn't quite there yet. And I think it's so interesting to think of that, giving them a task like analyzing a poem. Here's our system, we go through analyzing poem, and their assessment is analyze a poem that they've never seen before, but they have all of the the information and the knowledge to do that. And I feel like that's a good way to evaluate critical thinking. I mean, to a point.
Well, and that also directly ties with like the project-based learning that we were discussing a bit. The students can demonstrate their competencies and skills and knowledge through their piece, both in the process and in the final product. So if you tailor the project specifically based on like what you're trying to get out of the students, so like what is the learning outcome that you're trying to have the students work toward, and are they able to accurately reflect that through this particular project or not? And if not, then probably should change or reevaluate. Yeah, exactly. And then that also ties into collaborating with your peers a bit.
Yeah,
you can have your peers give you feedback on your assignments and assessments, let you know like what they think, provide like what's the word?
Feedback?
Yeah, well, there's a specific type of feedback. So not just generalized feedback, but you want it to be like
constructive.
Yeah, there we go.
Constructive criticism.
Having one of those moments.
No, and I think that's really good. And I've had, showing people assignments, and especially when you have a good relationship with someone, or you're kind of cut from the same cloth. Like, for example, I bonded more with my minor cooperating teacher than I did with my main one, because she's very cut and dry kind of person, and I'm more of a fluid, everything that we've been talking about. And the English teacher was more like me, so getting feedback from her actually, because she understood the way that my brain worked. But then it was also interesting to get feedback from someone who was like, you're way too confusing for the students. That was also challenging for me. But yeah, so that.
So how did you adapt to that? Do you find that like the teacher who was like different to you, do you think that kind of feedback was beneficial? Like, how did it help
Yeah,
you?
absolutely, because you have to reach those logical thinker learners, and I'm very everything is everything. Like, I'm very good at making connections, but then I lose the people who are like, wait, you said A equals, caterpillar, and I don't know how you got there, but I need A equals B, and then we can get to how it equals caterpillar, because I don't understand that. And it also helped me, she really got me to work on following the steps I had outlined in my own lesson plans, because I can't follow a lesson plan, apparently. I just talk to kids and respond to them.
How does that work out? Do you mean like, were you still getting across like what you wanted to get out of the lesson though, or was
yes
it like
and
more?
No. Sometimes I would, and then sometimes I wouldn't. So like, if we were having a class discussion and then I would introduce a concept that benefited our class discussion, then it would be good, or a new format. Okay. But then sometimes I would deviate from my lesson plan because I was like, you know what, I'm not feeling this. Like, I showed a video and I was like, you know what, in retrospect, I don't like that video. And, making that decision.
That shows that you have like some adaptability going, and that you'd be able to like communicate with your students a little better on that portion. So with my own cooperating teacher, I had like a similar issue in my lessons. I'd like start a lesson, I'd have something in mind, but then I wouldn't like necessarily follow the plan, and I'd end up not necessarily with the exact outcome that I wanted originally, but it was still similar in a sense. So my cooperating teacher ended up recommending that I use a list, like write down a list of steps for myself, just so like I know I need to do this, this, and this, but not necessarily specifics like within each part, just as long as I'm covering those specific parts, particularly with like what I'm saying through instruction. So if I'm going to be explaining something to the students, I need to explain this, this, and this before moving on.
Right. Yeah, and I would have that same problem as well. And I think it's really hard. And then especially when you give instructions and then your assessment is different than your instructions, or your assessment is too vague, or you're like I gave an assignment that was like, write a paragraph on how lyrics influenced your musical interpretation. That could be anything. And I got some awesome paragraphs, but like, not
necessarily what you wanted.
Well, but I didn't even know what I wanted. And
and that kind of like goes right back into like our starting with what is the learning outcome, right?
And so our understanding by design, which we haven't really talked about in this class, but
not in this class, but it's been a fundamental part of our education so far. So,
and we talked about
it's still relevant.
Bettina's like, okay, what do you want to teach them, and then what's the assessment, and then what are the activities you want to do? And I think that's really hard for us, because it's always like, oh, I have to be in front of these kids, what am I gonna do, instead of
and how am I gonna keep them engaged?
But
but sometimes the assignment, like if you're coming up with something, like how are you going to evaluate for this, that can spark ideas leading into an activity. So
the whole idea of teaching to the test, even if it's not a test, it's an assessment, teaching to the assessment rather than just random things.
So I was doing like a physical education for a lot of what I was teaching in my 3-week block, and a portion of that I had like a dance segment. So a lot of what they're supposed to learn in that particular grade is how they can incorporate movement through dance, and like how it becomes, what's the difference like between dance movement and like sport-based movement,
right?
So including like that rhythm and that kind of thing. But so when I was thinking about that, I had the idea of like them creating their own dance as like something that I'd be able to assess. And so leading through that, I like to get to that point, showed them like a few different examples of dances. So like line dance, we did cha-cha slide, and a few other random dances that I found online.
Yes.
So
thanks, internet.
But yeah, I took them through that process so they kind of like understand what dance is and like how it could look differently depending on what they're incorporating into the dance. And then I ended up trying to do the creative dance thing as a group, but I found that working like the whole class as a group was really difficult.
Yeah, that'd be
really
so hard.
Yeah, so a better approach is almost like splitting them up into smaller groups and having each come up with
their own.
Yeah, and then bringing it together into a larger piece after the fact.
What was their criteria for the dance?
Well, for that specifically, it wasn't a summative piece yet. It was just like getting them to practice that kind of process, because like I didn't have enough time in my 3-week block to actually go through like a full dance unit with them.
Right.
It was just like the intro, and I wanted them to have like a grasp of what goes into making a dance, right? So my co-op said that he'd like take off where I left off and kind of do the summative piece after.
Well, I think because I talked about the whole idea of, you know, if you're unfamiliar, like I'm familiar with dance, but most people aren't familiar with dance. So going through and doing those small assignments and then the assessment so that they're familiar with the medium, because I felt like that's a lot of the backlash is that I really, really enjoy all these creative assignments, but all we've been doing is essays and tests. So how do we, you know, encourage students to get into out of their comfort zone in a new medium, but the medium isn't actually what's being assessed, it's the content.
Right.
And so, you know, I talked about, you know, if I was making an assignment on Ableton, which is music editing software, doing exercises on Ableton first, and then, create a musical piece about your summer vacation, but then you already have the tools to do that. Right? Like teaching the building block skills like math instead of, you know, I remember in art they would say, make a watercolor background. I don't know how to do that, but just make it up.
That ties in like directly with the zone of proximal development. If you're familiar, if the students don't have the skill set to be able to use the technology or like the tools that you're integrating into the assignment, then they're not going to be able to perform at the level you're expecting out of them.
Right.
And
I think encouraging that exploration, and that, you know, I can learn all of these different things instead of what do I need to do to get out of this class kind of mentality. And like, this can be fun. And I think that also ties into, you know, how much time are you giving them? You know, whereas in the university setting, we just don't have the time, I find.
Sometimes even in the grade school and secondary educational settings,
the time isn't there.
Yeah.
Which is why the reliance on rubrics and tests
and adding in things like the field trips and the school meetings, like assemblies. That's the word.
And
spirit
teacher
interviews, spirit day, all that fun stuff. It cuts into their class time, and then we have less time to actually be able to go through the content. Another professor was talking about it was like more about the kind of learning outcomes still, but she said it in such a way that was like, so the outcomes that we have in curriculum, you want to tie the assessment directly to like the full outcome and not try to split it apart
in the indicators.
So I found that helpful in a way, because then you don't have to necessarily focus on each indicator and divide it up,
because that's way too many assignments. That's
It's
way too many. And I wouldn't want to do that, and I wouldn't make my students do that. No, I like that. So I think we're final thoughts on assessment.
Complex process.
Complex process.
A constant learning process.
I think it really depends on the relationship to your kids too, because
knowing the kids is super important.
Knowing the kids, and then also being able to say, you know what, team, I was not clear, and having the relationship to say, I made a mistake, and you're demonstrating that you are learning.
That ties right back into our authenticity piece. Like, if we're not able to, like, admit when we've made a mistake, then how can we expect our students to do the same?
Yeah.
And so.
Look at that. We came full circle. Authenticity in all things. I enjoyed this class. Honestly, it was one of my favorite classes. And I'm not just saying that because you're watching. Because it incorporated all of the things that I found missing. Because I'm like, how many reflections do I need to write down in order to prove to you that I can read and write?
Okay, I'm a little confused.
Oh,
so,
see,
like, what you mean?
did it. I just did it. Everything is everything. I just mean in other classes we write so many reflections, and we write about this and we write about that, and we write 10,000 lesson plans. I hope I've proved I can make a lesson plan
by now.
Yeah. But did I need to spend a whole course making 30 of them, or could we have done, making a unit, and how do our essential questions about that unit tie into assessment?
That's a good observation.
See?
Like that.
And that's why we need to think more about the big picture instead of, step by step. Oh, how are you going to number off? Like, that's all important, but I feel like we've had 3 courses on lesson planning.
Right, and the lesson planning is only like one particular portion of the puzzle. Whereas, like, assessment similarly is another piece to the puzzle, or instructions another piece to the puzzle, and the relationship building with the students, it all comes together into the one formative piece, or summative piece even, that's like, what are the students learning? What's the objective?
What's the relationship between what we're doing in class? And because I've been in even education classes and other classes where you're like, why did we spend a whole class talking about this, and then we never speak of it again, or it's not relevant? And I feel like as a teacher, you really need to tie everything back to your assessment piece, and make it authentic.
Well, particularly the evaluation portion of the assessment. And we shouldn't forget that we are also using assessment throughout, not necessarily to actually grade the students' performance, but also just to see like where they're at and where we're at as teachers, whether we're being effective in our teaching strategies or not.
So it's like an assessment for us as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, the kids are grading us. Flipped classroom.
Well, they can, and that also I think it ties in with everything, because like if we're having good communication with our students, they'll feel more comfortable approaching us and letting us know what was effective for them in their learning or what wasn't.
Right.
And then that helps us in turn to be more effective teachers.
So the next time we give that assignment, we can be like, oh yeah, this kid said that I don't speak clearly.
Yeah.
Or say things clearly. All right.
Thank you for the conversation.
Thanks. This was good.